I am really honored and humbled to be back today. This feels like old home week. It's been fun to see people, meet new friends, and see some old ones. As Tina mentioned, I am somebody that has been in the classroom by choice. I had the honor of starting off in the California as an educator, and to be completely honest, this had not been my intended path. When I was first young and many pant sizes ago, I wanted at that time to be a marriage, family, and child counselor, and so I was actually enrolled in a master's program to do that, following earning a Bachelor of Arts in psychology. And I had a girlfriend who was a principal, and she said, I have this class that is not yet covered for the year. Could you come and just cover this class for just 2 days? I'm going to find a teacher. Now, for everybody in the room, let me tell you what that class was that was uncovered. Can you guess? Okay, yep, exactly. It was a class of kids that had exceptionalities. It was middle school, 7th and 8th grade, and self-contained. So that 2 days stretched into 2 weeks, and I knew absolutely nothing. When I was growing up, I thought a lesson was something that your father was going to teach you when you got home, when you totally messed up. And I didn't realize what a consequence was, like just something that's teaching you about new behavior. But a consequence in my book when I was growing up was, again, something that you were going to get when that person got home. Well, that 2 days stretched into 2 weeks, and I kept telling the kids the whole time, they're going to find you a real teacher. I'm not a real teacher. You're totally going to get a real teacher. But I was so excited about that opportunity. When I was growing up, I just wanted my teachers to like me. I had a wonderful kindergarten teacher. Her name was Miss Colton. And when I was little, she had this reinforcer system that you got a bumblebee. It was the Good Bee of the Day award. And in 179 days of instruction, I never earned that because I just couldn't hush up long enough to actually get that. It's still a distant memory. And somebody from a presentation similar to this actually mailed me a construction paper bumblebee. And I want to thank that person if they're here today. So thank you. I mention this because at the beginning I was a little lost thinking about getting into education, wasn't sure how that was going to go, and at the end of that 2-week period, I actually told the kids, at this point I got to get back to my real life because I've missed 2 weeks of graduate school, but they're going to find somebody who knows what they're doing. And a girl, her name was Tamika, she was 14 years old, and she stood up and she said, girlfriend, I think you're doing a really good job with us, and she's like, and I think you should stay. And I'm like, okay. So I quit that master's program, I enrolled in teacher education. I was living in a very lean reinforcement condition that a 14-year-old's one praise statement changed my entire life, but I'm glad it did. And I want to let you know that began my journey of figuring out how to do it better, how to know what to teach, how to teach it. And at that time in California, you couldn't become a special education teacher without also becoming a general education teacher. And I was very fortunate to have experiences in both the general and special education community. And then after that time, I became a behavior specialist because I saw so much need, so many kids that were not getting what they needed in instruction because they kept getting bounced out of class. So they were growing old together in on-campus suspension and missing so much instruction. Following that time in the classroom and as a behavior specialist, then I was on faculty at University of Arizona, Cal State Los Angeles. I was at Vanderbilt for 10 years. I was at UNC Chapel Hill, and now I'm at University of Kansas. And I can keep a job, and I am not in the witness protection program. But I'm telling you all this because what I'm going to propose we do today may sound lofty, but this work, this science, has actually been influenced by thousands of teachers and even more students and very healthy and exciting administrators. And these ideas that I'm sharing are not just my own, but they represent the work of many different team members today. So you started off yesterday with an inspiring, passionate keynote address, and you have been filling your souls with the good work done, and it was so exciting to go to that keynote or the breakout session yesterday and get to go to the poster session and see what you've been doing and seeing the footprint that has been left for the great work that's been led by Tina Lawson and others for all these years. As she mentioned, you are the one that brought screening into this state. So today we're going to start at the beginning and think about this system of work that we do. And today my goal for you is to think about the great things that you've already done and walk out with one new idea to explore. If you were to take a picture right now in the United States of America, you would find that there are many, many kids that are struggling with behaviors that actually get in the way of instruction. And if you were to take that same picture of the United States and look at it, you would find about 12% of all school-age kids struggle with either internalizing issues, shy, anxious, withdrawn, or acting out behaviors. And as you look at that graphic, that little Venn diagram shows you that there's overlap. So there's actually, the correlation coefficient is 0.52, so 25% shared variance for those of you who care. But we've got kids that are struggling with both. But what's most likely to capture our attention is the acting out behaviors, because that's what gets in the way of instruction. But as a researcher and as a mother, what I worry often about are those kids with internalizing issues, because those kids are not going to do things that are going to capture our attention in the same way of acting out behavior. And it might even more alarm you to know that in that same picture, it's 20% of school-age kids have mild to severe problems. So where are these kids? These kids are alive and well and living in general education. And less than 1% of school-age kids will go on to receive special education services under the category of emotional disturbance, which means that these are all our kids. These are our responsibilities to build systems to meet their academic, behavior, and social and emotional needs. And the work you're doing in Pennsylvania is right on point. How many of you are in schools that are at least in the beginning stages of implementing a tiered approach? Right, raise your hand high and look around. And that's wonderful, because we can't do it as an individual person. And when you think about the priorities that are currently being placed on systems, there is such a priority, and you've been ahead of the curve for a long time. There was a keynote address given in 2014, several years ago, and this man, Michael Uden, stood up and said that it was as important for our educational systems to build systems that not only address academics, but also prioritize kids' behavior and social and emotional well-being. And I 100% agree with that. I could have kissed that man on the mouth, but I knew that was wrong, despite my limited social skills, so I kept it to myself. But that is the work of what CI3T is, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is what this system is that actually takes that charge and puts it together. And when we think about all the tiered systems that are out there, and it started back in the day with RTI and then PBIS, and then they started showing up. Do you remember the slide where there used to be like one triangle this way for RTI, then a separate slide, there was a triangle facing this way for positive behavior support? And then do you remember when they showed up on the same slide? With that little bit of space in between, it was like a middle school dance, everybody showed up, but nobody was touching. So then they started touching. We had MTSS show up on the scene. And CI3T is distinct from MTSS in that it is a broadening of MTSS, broadened to also address social and emotional learning. So rather than having separate systems in a building, like one group of people that's looking at academic data, one that's looking at behavior data, and one that's looking at social and emotional well-being, put that all together. Because when these kids come in, like if it's me coming to your school, this is Kathleen Lynn Lane, and I might be one hot mess. I might have tier 1 needs for academics. I might have tier 2 needs for social skills, at which point Tina would probably tell me it's tier 3 needs for social skills. And I might have no additional needs whatsoever for internalizing issue. So when we think about the work that's been done with CI3T, as I mentioned, it started a long time ago. It actually started in the late 90s in California, and it has progressed with learning opportunities, including those here in Pennsylvania, all the way across the country. And now, thanks to our great partners with COI and other teams, we actually have now manualized this process where people can take all the good things that they're doing in their district and their school and build one integrated system. And part of that importance on building integrated systems is a priority, because we need to make sure that we're being efficient and effective and respectful of teachers' times. We need to, in this system, create some clarities. We're asking teachers to do a lot. And it can't be one more 10-minute thing that's in your mailbox at the end of the day. So in a CI3T system, it starts by building transparencies for what every student needs to know, what every faculty and staff needs to know, what our families need to know, and what our administrators are going to support us in. So we decide what are the tier 1 happenings for every single student that they get just by virtue of showing up. Also in that model, at the very core, is positive behavior intervention and support, following the same standards and recommendation as those by the National Center. There is one major distinction in this, that to remember that it's not the same as academics or social and emotional learning. It's not something that you buy, it's something that you build based on the value and the culture of your community. Now, in a CI3T model, these expectation matrices, and will you give me a hands up high if you have these somewhere in your building or a building that you support? Look around the room. Great. In a CI3T model, that leadership team, rather than it being just the leadership team that's informing the building of these expectations, we actually have a tool, and it's called the School-Wide Expectations Survey for Specific Settings. And it's actually something that you survey every person that's employed in your school, and by all I mean all. It goes to every parapro, every teacher, gen ed, special ed teacher, your bus drivers, your cafeteria, because frankly, who knows better about what's expected for behavior on the bus than who? The bus driver. Now remember, from an applied behavior analytic lens, this is your instructional tool. This is what we're going to use to teach behavior. So we have to make sure that it's more than a song, it's more than a poster, that you've actually identified expectations, as you know, that if taught and kids engage in them, they're likely to receive acknowledgments that will eventually lead to naturally occurring reinforcement. Now, the other part, the distinct part of CI3T, is that there's equal priority given to social and emotional learning. So we start at the beginning thinking about who are the men and women that you want to graduate from your system. So who are the people that you want to walk out the door with at the end of 12th grade and be the people that you want to shop with at TJ Maxx, be behind you when you're going to get your 99-cent unsweet iced tea in McDonald's drive-thru. So what we do in a CI3T training process is we actually walk through and vet resources to help districts and schools figure out what makes the most sense based on your district priorities for bringing in a validated social and emotional learning curriculum, and it's explicitly taught at Tier 1, just like we teach academics. People will often ask me, is that even possible to do this at high school? And the answer is absolutely. We've had wonderfully strong implementers. I'm going to show you some data from some of their schools. But the idea is that when kids come from preschool to high school, you're going to teach according to the instructional schedule based on whatever program you selected, but we want to teach those soft skills in the same way that we would teach any academic skills. And it's very much a priority that we think about purling in something that has enough evidence behind it to suggest that if you do it with fidelity, it will work. In some of our district partners, they've selected things like positive action or connect with kids. And we never tell people what to pick, but we put them into resources such as What Works Clearinghouse. And if you're not familiar with that, write that down, What Works Clearinghouse. They've done the work for you to vet all these different types of supports. But whatever the priority is, whatever is selected at Tier 1, you actually build an instructional schedule, and this whole thing together, that's Tier 1. So that it's clarity on academics, on social and emotional learning, and then we use our positive behavior interventions supports framework to make sure that kids have clarity on what's expected at each different setting. So as we think about the work that you are doing right now at Tier 1, I'd like you to take 5 of these 10 minutes and pretend to have this first conversation. What are you doing well at Tier 1? Where are you in terms of your clarities on academics, on your positive behavior intervention support frame, and what are you doing to support social and emotional learning? So let's take 5 of these 10 minutes and have that conversation, then we're going to come back. All right. If you want to go ahead and close your conversation. If you're going to take that picture, I need to suck everything in. I'm just kidding. All right, and then wrap up that last thought. Come on home. Fantastic. When I was able to touch base with a few of the tables, it was super inspiring and very telling of the people that are in the room. There's already people that have pulled up What Works Clearinghouse. They're checking out the evidence behind what they have in place in their building. Some people are having some rich conversations saying they've got the right ideas, but they're not yet to consistency in the building. So they're working towards fidelity. As you're thinking about today, I think one of the nicest things about this particular conference and this particular experience is that you have a huge array of resources on effective, feasible strategies that work. And as you're thinking about the systems that you've built in your own context, I think today you're really here to continue to bring back some tools to put into your toolkit, and also to think from a systems perspective. Because when we go to these things and we get inspired and we want to bring things back, we have to also be cautious about not overwhelming our system. Because we don't want it to be like the next bright, shiny thing. I saw this, I'm going to do it, I don't remember what she said, but she made me laugh, and there was something a little inappropriate, and they had to edit it out, and I'm sorry to the videographers. So as we're thinking about today, I want you to know that building a CI3T model of prevention takes time. And in our training model, it actually spans an entire academic year where your CI3T leadership becomes that blending of your building leadership team, your PBS team, your mental health team, your academic team, and that team goes through a systematic approach in which they're essentially building a blueprint for your school to define everything that's happening in your building. And when we think about the outcome of that training process, we know it's going to take a while. This is shared with permission as part of our partnership grant, which was funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. We partnered with Lawrence Public School System, and they built a training model where they first built CI3T for all 14 elementary schools, and that represents the green bar. When they started implementing in their first year, then they brought down their middle and high schools, they built their blueprints, and then when they started implementing, they built them the blueprints for their college and career center. So I say this at the front today to, as you're thinking about the things that inspire you that you want to take back and get more information on, know that it's going to be a journey, and we have to give ourselves permission to grow. The end output of each of those schools' experience was actually a blueprint that says, here's how we do business at our high school, our middle school, at our elementary school. And some of these things contained what I would call to be district certainties. So that from a district perspective, there's certain things that you're going to want to be common across all of your elementary schools, like your approach to reading instruction, or how you're benchmarking academic and behavioral performance, the latter of which we'll talk about today. There are certain Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports, like check-in, check-out, that have enough evidence behind them to suggest we should have those, ideally, in every single school, every single system. So at the beginning of this process, people walk through and begin to build the elements of Tier 1. This is an example from an elementary blueprint where they're defining what's expected in terms of how we teach reading and math, the instructional blocks. These are some of the low-intensity strategies that are teacher-led, that are done at Tier 1 to support kids' engagement and reduce disruption. And as Tina mentioned, we'll have a breakout session today. We'll go into more detail, and those of you who I was able to touch base with, these are all on the website. These are on-demand resources. And in addition to teaching behavior, we also want to have in your blueprint a plan for responding when the wheels fall off the bus. And by that I mean, when kids do have challenging behaviors, we want to make sure that every adult in the building knows how to respectfully and responsibly and safely respond to challenging behavior. Ideally, with an emphasis on preventing it from happening in the first place, because we want school to be a positive, productive, and joyful experience for kids. And just like we had to have plans for how we're going to teach our reading curriculum or a science curriculum, we also have to have a plan for how we're going to address social and emotional learning. One of the high schools that we work with, their principal leaders, they had their principal and vice principal, one of them on the team. They mapped out an instructional schedule where they actually had the first lesson taught by first period, 2 weeks later the next lesson was taught by second period, 2 weeks later the next, because they were protecting instructional time across the school day and communicating to every student in that building that this is enough of a priority that every teacher is going to be teaching this and weaving those soft skills throughout instruction. That whole thing then has to get taught. And remember, in any tiered system, we are changing the student experience by changing the adult experience. We are changing the student experience by changing the adult experience. So we have to teach it to our adults, and then we have them support our students in meeting their needs. When we talk about the reinforcement element that so many of you were celebrating last night in the poster session, we have to remember to acknowledge our adults. I praised somebody in the back corner that had the What Works Clearinghouse side up. And if I had had a ticket, I would have given it to her right then with some behavior-specific praise of way to log in. That was nice to see you engaged. And then, like everything else, we have to make sure that we know this is happening, because anybody can build a blueprint, but we have to make sure that we know it's taking place, and we have to get people's input on it. So as part of CI3T, there's a couple things that are happening. Just like in any tiered system, we have to have a plan for how we're going to teach all key stakeholders. And I respectfully encourage you to build on the fine work that's been done with the National Center. I encourage you to build on the fine work in particular of Mark Wiest in thinking about the role of families. We need to let families know what we're doing in the school context as we build those partnerships. And we also need to think about that idea of acknowledgement. And we go back to our behavior analytic roots. We know that everybody's motivated by something. Some kids want to access things, and some kids want to avoid things. The same is true for teachers. We had a panel as part of our Day 6 training schedule. We were working with schools to finish their building, and we had some people come back. And in one of the systems, jeans are not permitted to be worn by adults in the building. That is their biggest acknowledgement for teachers, is that they actually get a button that has a pair of blue jeans on it, and they get to wear that so that they don't get anybody sweating them for wearing jeans. Another group of people, for a while thought that applied behavior analytic principles didn't apply to 8th graders until they discovered that using tickets to access hot chocolate in the building was a game changer. So it's just about figuring out the novelty of what is acknowledging. And to do those types of things, I want to remind people that it's not just like you build a blueprint and then you launch it. It's not like a clock where you wind it and then let it go. We need ongoing professional learning. So when you're thinking about your own communication structure and your own set of professional learning, one of the things I love most about this framework for meeting kids' academic behavior and social and emotional learning is that in addition to it being data-informed learning for students, it's data-informed professional learning for the adults. And I want to say that again, data-informed professional learning for adults. It's not a canned thing. We need to find out from the adults in the building, how is this going for you and where are your next steps for learning? One of the things we talk about is during implementation, when people start launching CI3T, in fall and in spring, there's 2 sets of feedbacks. Many of you are already building on treatment integrity, but many people have not yet started putting in formal touch points for social validity. Social validity means basically, am I on board with the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes? In other words, do I think this is working? And we use that set of feedback to know where to drive in professional learning. So if you're getting a lot of comments of, I don't understand why we're teaching social and emotional learning, why we're teaching the soft skills, I would touch on it there. If people are asking instead about I'm on board for the why, but I don't know the how, how do I get that done? Or some people are doing all the pieces but want more support on integration. Social validity is really important, and one thing for anybody that does professional learning, if you're in this room, one thing that we learned early on in 2009 is that during the building process, what the school sites think of the draft plan after session 4 actually predicts how well they'll implement it during their first year. And that is a game changer, because if that score is low, we know we've got more work to do. But social validity is important, because if we're not on board, why would people invest in it? When my son was in elementary school, he was watching something on TV, and he came up to me, and he's like, Mom, here's a 1-800 number, and if you call this number, they will send you 2 things. They will send you a cream to attack your wrinkles from the outside, and they will send you a pill to attack your wrinkles from the inside. And I'm like, Nathan, I really appreciate you, looking out for me. And I said, but this is normal. When mommies get a little bit older, sometimes they get a little bit softer, a little bit more wrinkly. And he said to me, Mom, it doesn't have to be like this, because my friends' moms don't look like that. True story. We love Nathan, and I appreciate that support so much. However, I did not call that 1-800 number because that was not my goal. I have earned every one of these, and I encourage you, if you're doing this right now, go like this, because otherwise you're going to get this big-ass line like I have right here from being really curious for a long period of time. But I've earned every wrinkle, every pound, every drop of cellulite, all of it. I'm proud of it. So I didn't access that intervention because it was not aligned with my goal. So we want to make sure we're doing goal alignment. The other thing in CI3T, as in other tiered systems, we need to know if it's happening. We're asking for a tall order. We're asking people to teach in an integrated way. Teach academics, use behavior supports to facilitate engagement, and weave in social and emotional learning. And to do that, we need to make sure we're providing high quality professional learning, and we have to know if it's happening. Because if you do not collect treatment integrity data, then this is just like a guy talking about his dating life in high school. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. You got to bring the data. And the data need to be shared. So one of our big points of feedback from people is that when they're telling you, and when we're surveying people, the schools are not just serving their CI3T leadership team, they're getting input from every adult in the building because those are the people that are delivering Tier 1. And so we need to make sure that we're sharing it back in a way that is constructive and not viewed as punitive or Big Brother watching, but is used to shape the next set of experiences. And then, just like we benchmark kids academically, we also need to benchmark kids behaviorally. And in Pennsylvania, you guys are crushing it. Yeah, I saw last night in the poster session, several people actually were displaying their data. You've been screening for quite some time, and that's very impressive. A next target for us is going to be now using those data to connect kids to Tier 2 supports and to connect kids to Tier 3 supports. And as we think about Tier 2 and Tier 3, a couple things to hang on to. Tier 2, there are no Tier 2 kids, no little yellow kids. There are kids that have Tier 2 needs, and they are fluid. Like I might have certain Tier 2 needs in social skills. Tina might be my peer model. Oh God, we are in real trouble if that's the case. That's not the case. But we're gonna have kids that have different Tier 2 needs, and some of it will be enrichment. It's not all remediation. You're gonna have some kids that need to be stretched, so they might need like book studies. You're gonna have some kids that need both. In this model, we strongly encourage you not to make a separate list of here's academic Tier 2, here's behavioral Tier 2, here's social skills Tier 3 or Tier 2. Because we're going to tackle those in an integrated way. And we're going to do the same in terms of Tier 3 supports. And these are reserved for kids with the highest level of intensity need. This is not special education in this model. Kids on an IEP are accessing every level of prevention. So Tier 2 and Tier 3 are additive, and I see people nodding. I'm preaching to the choir, and I love that about you. And we know this is a journey. So when you think about what you're doing right now, think about how you're teaching Tier 1, how you're acknowledging adults in your building, and what you're doing with monitoring. And I'm going to ask you the hard question of, are you checking in with people twice a year minimum to find out what they think about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes? Are you assessing fidelity data and using it, and are you screening? And if you're not yet doing social validity yet, that's okay. There's on that website, if you click on measures, there's a tool called Primary Intervention Rating Scale. We call it the PIRS. Feel free to download and look at it. It takes just about 5 to 10 minutes for teachers to do it. But let's go ahead and have another quick conversation about what you're currently doing. And if you don't yet have things organized into one integrated blueprint, what might be some of the benefits that support collaboration between general and special education teachers, collaboration with families, clarity with your administrator is what's expected. So let's take 5 of these 10 minutes to see where are your strengths and what are you thinking about for next steps. One of the first conversations I tapped into, people were talking about they've got a lot of those strong elements, but it's not connected. For example, some people might be doing Tier 2 interventions in social skills or addressing social and emotional learning, but people don't know what's happening in those interventions. And if you don't know what's happening there, then I don't know how to weave it into my daily instruction. Raise your hand if you're a general education teacher in this room. Right. Magical Tier 2 supports without communication with the general education community is not effective. And kids will tell you, what I'm learning isn't working. If people in your main context don't know what's happening, we can't reinforce those new skills. So that coordination, that clarity is right on point. So as we start thinking about all the happenings in your building, I love the fact that you have so much going on. The common themes were we have pieces but not all. We need consistency. And thus far, most people have not yet dipped a toe into actually soliciting people's input in fall and in spring to find out what they think about the goals and the procedures and the outcomes. And I'm going to suggest that we need that information so we know how to build the professional learning that we provide along the way throughout the year. So now we're going to fast forward a little bit and think about like how do we move kids between those two tiers, between Tier 2 and Tier 3. And I want to charge you with something also, that before we start thinking about putting a kid into Tier 2 or Tier 3, let's look at our data. Because we don't want to be the person to tell a parent that their child needs Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports if we don't even know what Tier 1's happening in the classroom. We also don't want to only have Tier 1 in place because you don't want to be the person that says, dude, we got nothing, your kid is super at risk, but we are totally going to a Tier 2 training next year, so just hang tight. We can't do that. So we have to rip off the Band-Aid, organize what we have, and make sure that we are empowering our teachers to use data to connect kids to supports after we've checked ourselves. So when we think about systematic screening, and we're going to talk about this briefly right now, but I want to give you the big idea behind it. And I know many of you are screening already, and we're going to talk about how to use those data. But just real quick, let's talk about some of the tools that are used and how they're used. With academic screening, we benchmark fall, winter, and spring. We do it as soon as kids come back, and it requires time. Behavior screening is a little different. It's done 3 times a year, and what we're talking about are teacher-completed screenings. So this is not a committee decision. You're not asking kids questions. This is an independent teacher-completed rating scale, and that's important. So when we do those, we're doing these also 3 times a year, but we don't do our behavior screenings as soon as kids come back from summer because we need time to let them settle in. So you would want to follow the directions in the technical manuals, but in brief, you tend to wait 4 to 6 weeks, and that's your fall time point. You screen again before winter break, and that's important because in middle and high schools, when they're changing schedules and things, if you wait till January, they've often changed schedules. And then we screen again in spring so that we can see what's happening about 4 to 6 weeks before the end of the year. And so those are your 3 time points. The wait time at the beginning of the year is important because our behavior changes and your behavior changes. I remember when I was teaching middle school back in the day, at the beginning of every year, I think this is the year I'm going to be a better role model. I'm not going to drink Diet Coke in front of these kids. I'm going to be all healthy. I'm going to shave both legs every day. I'm going to wear nice clothes. And then to be completely honest, by October, I'm like rocking an entire little red wagon of Diet Coke because that's what I need to get to 11 a.m. And I'm wearing the same exact pair of jeans, I know, Monday through Thursday, because if I wash them, I sure as hell am not going to be able to button them. And I have to save my best sweats for Friday. So I get it. Like, we change, they change, but we need to let everybody settle in. So when we think about doing screenings, and all the details, you can go to pbis.org, you can go to ci3t.org. There's all kinds of logistics, including little videos that you can click on to watch how implementers are actually doing this. So the details are there, but in order to screen, we want to make sure that you bring in a systematic screening that is psychometrically sound and is feasible for you to sustain from the long haul. And I am not here to tell you which one to pick, but I'm here to tell you they're not interchangeable. So if you start with one in fall, you can't switch to a different one in winter. It'd be like starting with Ames Webb's and then jumping on to Dibbles or something. So when we do these screenings, I want to give you just a couple little glimpses as to what this looks like. One of the original screening tools was the systematic screening for behavior disorders, and I think this is an excellent tool as it allows you to look for both major challenges of early childhood. On the left-hand side of that graph, you see blue bars. On the right, you see green bars. And I want to show you those dates. That says winter 2007, winter 2008, and winter 2009. And I am showing you this intentionally to show you screening is not new. Screening has been around for a while. You can trust the psychometrics behind that. In that particular one elementary school, when they looked at their winter data in that first time point, in that particular screening tool, it's a multiple gating screening tool. So your top 3 kids with the highest levels of externalizing pass through the first gate, top 3 with the more boisterous, which is or the internalizing issues also pass through that first gate. And then of those that pass through that first gate, teachers complete additional information on just a subset of kids. Now listen carefully to this part. On that bar, of the 60 kids that pass through gate 1, 13 kids exceeded normative criteria. That represents 6% of the entire school. Make sense so far? The next year, the school got bigger, so they added a teacher. So that's why that bar got bigger, because you have more kids passing through that first gate. And then you see that in that year, you have 7 kids that exceeded normative criteria, meaning they had higher than average acting out behaviors. That represented 3% of the entire school. And it remained pretty stable the next year. Now, this is not a randomized control trial, so researcher hat, do not draw causal inferences on this. But this is what's happening descriptively when they're implementing CI3T. At that same time, jump on the other side of that dotted line, in winter 2007, the 60 kids that passed through the first gate for the internalizing, shy, anxious, withdrawn, in that particular school, they had 17 kids that exceeded normative criteria. That was almost 9% of their school. And then do you see what's happening in the next years? So where was the biggest challenge in that school? Was it externalizing or was it internalizing? Very good. And that's exactly why we have to look at these data. And the thing is, if you don't screen, you will miss these kids with internalizing issues because they're not going to be doing things that are going to earn office discipline referral. So now, for anybody that's ever written a school improvement plan or made targets about how to improve social and emotional well-being, I can have these data. And now, if you are a social worker, school psychologist, et cetera, instead of it being, do you have anybody? Do you have anybody? Do you have anybody? We're done with that. We're going to look at these data in addition to other data like attendance, is a kid a regular attender, and your fidelity data, are they actually coming to school? And now we're going to have these wonderful points of data to follow a long period of time. Here's another example from winter, looking over time for externalizing and for internalizing. So we're going to create transparencies around these data, and these data are used to shape instruction. You can also break these data down by grade level. So like if I was a high school or elementary principal and these were my data, those 3 kids that are screening in as having critical needs for externalizing issues, I would invest in First Step to Success. That's a validated program available at Tier 3. That's what I would do for those kids. That's a reasonable amount. Make sense? So will you have this next conversation about screening? Are you doing it? If so, are you using the data? If you're not yet screening in your building, this would be a time to commit to checking out what's available for screening. And there's a tab called Systematic Screening, and I'm going to invite you just to log into that if you've got just a moment to see the resources there so you're comfortable when you leave today. So let's take 5 of these 10 to look at this particular one. For 1,900 people, you guys are rocking the transitions, and I appreciate you playing the school game. It really inspires me to see how many people are really interested in learning at shaping practices in their building and doing it responsibly. If you're not screening right now, your first charge is to see what tools are available, how they would work in your context, like are they normed in a way that makes sense for you to use them? And then you want to think about the long game in this. Like, can you bring this in and install it? There are wonderful commercially available products. There are free access tools. I know that several of you in this room started off using the Student Risk Screening Scale, which was also developed out of Oregon. That last tool I told you was developed by Hill Walker and his colleagues. I have infinite amount of respect for him. He is what I would consider to be the leader in the world on systematic screening, and a hell of a nice guy. Another really strong leader at University of Oregon is Drummond, and he developed this free access screening tool. And when I first looked at this, there's 7 items, there are no operational definitions, and that gave me pause as a behavior analyst. However, our team alone has done 17 psychometric studies to see how these function, and I want you to listen carefully to me right now. In this screener, again, it's one teacher completing a screener, it's independent. So if Karen is screening the kids in her class, she rates across, she fills it out, and every kid's going to get a total score that puts them into a category of low, moderate, or high risk. These data, you are not linking them specifically to an intervention. So it's not like Kathleen got a 3 on steals, she needs a stealing intervention. This is what you're looking for. Do these behaviors occur together and to a high enough degree? Because if they do, that total score is what's predicting important outcomes from kids. So how we use this is important. We're not using it to exclude kids. We're using this to shape our instruction. If it looks like an Excel spreadsheet, it's because it is. Tina and Becky and others, like everybody's done wonderful, wonderful jobs getting this installed. Across the state of Pennsylvania, we had great lessons to be learned here, and they've built phenomenal systems in terms of at each different district and a little bit different at different districts. On the My Blissy website, you can see other training resources, but we now have the ability, although that tool was initially started at the elementary level, it's now been tested for use at the middle and high school levels, and it's not every teacher rating every class, it's one class period that the teacher rates when all the kids are in the building. These are data from a middle school, and that first year is 2004. Look at how long they've been screening and doing CI3T. Still want to say the same thing. This is not a randomized control trial, so don't overgeneralize. But what do you notice happening to those green bars over time? They're getting bigger, right? Which means that the percentage of kids at low risk is getting bigger. In 2008, do you see how they had like very, very small number of kids in the red? I always feel like I need to say those are like those weight loss commercials that we watch in the middle of the night when we can't sleep. So those results are not typical. You're usually going to get to about 3 to 5% in the red and about 15 to 20% in the yellow. The next year, when they had an increase in risk, and their data, the first thing they did is go back and looked at their treatment integrity data. And as they had onboarded new teachers, what had they forgotten? Very good. They forgot the training. Now they had the data to figure it out. They did a boot camp and moved it forward. In terms of how those data work, building on the conversation we just had, we've learned that those total scores actually predict how kids do in an academic year. So if you look at those data, that's from the school I just showed you, the kids that started off the year in the low risk category, by the end of the year, those kids had earned 1.5 office discipline referrals. The group that started off the year in the yellow, they earned on average 5, and then the last group of high risk students, they earned on average 8.5. So their fall scores predicted how they ended the year. And for everybody that said, that doesn't really matter, I just need to get through my curriculum, I get it. Check out the grade point average and course failures. How they did at the beginning of the year actually predicted how they ended the year academically. And there was no statistically significant difference between the moderate and high risk group, which means any sign of behavior and social and emotional risk at the beginning of the year is going to impact academics. So we have done other studies since then. Other research teams have synthesized the data. We see this similar pattern in high school. And through the partnerships that we've had here in Pennsylvania and other places, we've been able to expand that tool now by adding 5 additional items to it to actually detect kids that also have internalizing issues. So there are now 2 versions of this tool, and you are welcome to download this. You can access it yourself, as it is built in an Excel spreadsheet, but you'd want to work with your district to build the system that makes sense. We've learned that peer rejection, the role of peer rejection actually shifts in the middle and high school years. It becomes more characteristic of internalizing than externalizing, which means we need to pay attention as to how we're using those cut scores. So at the elementary level, if you're at the elementary school, here's how you add those up to get 2 different scores now, one for internalizing and one for externalizing. These are more recent data from a school implementing CI3T. This is their externalizing subtotal, which is just the sum of those items. And what do you notice here in this school? Same thing, right? The percentage of kids in the green is getting bigger, and the percentage of kids in the moderate and high risk category is getting smaller. This, to me, is the biggest gain right here, is that you can now look at internalizing issues in your building with a free access screening tool. So in this particular one, this is looking at the percentage of kids with low, moderate, and high internalizing issues. So now, something that is a more covert behavior, we can catch this. And this is a free access screening tool, and it takes about 15 minutes to screen your school. Requires no time with kids. If you do it, you should do it in a regularly scheduled faculty meeting. And same thing, I want to be able to unpackage it to look for pockets of challenges so I know where to push in. And in terms of predictive validity, going back to how these data work, we've now done psychometric studies to see if it is, continuing to be true that those fall scores predict year-end outcomes. And we're finding the same to be true for internalizing as well. So those fall scores predict how kids end the year in terms of reading performance, oral reading fluency, and MAP. It also predicts how many days how many visits they go to the nurse for. And I'm not saying a nurse is a bad thing, but the fact that they're needing to access that support is an indication of concern, or it might be that they're escaping. So when we look at the middle school, I want to mention that those cut scores are a little bit different, and they can be used in the same way. These are actually data that a high school principal sent to me to say, hey, I talked to one of my math teachers and he mentioned we have enough data now to look at trend. So this is how he shared the data with his CI3T leadership team and then later his faculty and staff. So you see how he has it low, moderate, and high, and by year? It's like textbook pretty. And then I'd like you to look over here on the right-hand side for internalizing. And so we're seeing those shifts in time. What I'd like you to do is jump into a very short conversation of, are you willing to dip a toe into it? Either using the data or considering screening. So thinking about screening as a whole, and before you launch this conversation, I want to be transparent. There's a lot of other screening tools. I've only shown you a couple. Some of you might already be using the BAS3 BESS, which is a factor analytically derived tool. Some of you might also be using the performance screening guide. Whatever you're using, jump into that conversation now. Wonderful conversations about screening. And most people are not concerned about whether or not to do it, and I think you're right on point. The big question nowadays isn't should we screen, the big question is which screening tool should we pick? Like what makes the most sense? So we want to be responsible in how we use those screening data because you're going to use these in multiple different ways. These are data from one school. When they got these data, their initial request was for Tier 2 support, and that shows reading, math, pro-social behavior, and motivation. Is Tier 1 where you would start? No. Where would you start? Tier 1. When you have that many kids having additional needs at Tier 2, Catherine's going to be the first person to tell you, we need to push hard at Tier 1. This creates some transparency on how to do that. That's very different than this middle school that I showed you a few minutes ago, where things are on point. Ideally, one of the big charges you want to work towards is being able to draw down multiple sources of data together so that you can build something like this, where you'll be able to pull down your screening data with other data. For example, we want to make sure that we can know the full picture of the kids. How are they doing in reading? How are they doing in written expression? Are they regular attenders? Are they accessing other supports? Because if I've got a kid that has Tier 3 needs for reading and behavioral excesses, and they're not a regular attender at school, that's going to shape my intervention very differently than if I separated it. In our breakout session that we're going to go to shortly, we're going to be building on these conversations about looking at multiple sources of data together. And I want to dip a toe into this before we conclude today. That as part of Tier 1, we want to make sure there's some clarities of what CI3T is. It is a broadening of MTSS. It's broadened to also address kids' social and emotional well-being. It is a commitment to using multiple sources of data to inform instruction for students and to inform professional learning experiences for the adults in the building. In our breakout session that we're going to go to next, I'm going to want to have a plan for looking at multiple sources of data together like this. And these are hypothetical kids' names. But I want you to find one kid on that row and follow that child across. If you were to only look at one piece of information, you would drive differently than if you only looked at behavior screening. Right. So if I'm a kid that is struggling with internalizing issues and I can't read, and you call on me during reading, you can't be surprised that I'm not going to be jumping in with both feet. So when we think about what we need to do at Tier 1 is put some tools in our teachers' toolkits. Because I'm here to say, I have worked at some amazing universities through the years, but I can tell you a really strong challenge that we pose, and when we start to do these integrated systems, is that teachers at most get one class in exceptionality. You get one class, and you get like 1 day on emotional disturbance, 1 day on learning disabilities. And if you're lucky, you get 1, maybe 2 classes in classroom management. And I'm here to tell you, people do not leave our profession because they don't know how to teach the content. People leave and feel burnt out because they get mowed over by the behavior that they're struggling to manage. And amen, somebody give a shout out back there. And I'm happy to say that based on the work of Scott Ross and Wendy Oakes and others, we've learned that teachers' emotional well-being is better in some of these tiered systems. In CI3T specifically, we are seeing shifts in burnout. We are seeing teachers having a stronger sense of self-efficacy. They are less likely to depersonalize from kids. They're still emotionally exhausted, but I frankly think that's the business of teaching. And so as we build these systems, what I want to leave you with is that, thank you, you are so reinforcing. High five to you. As we close out this session and we think about the integrated systems that you have, I am going to challenge you to dig a little deeper. Let's check. How would you feel really about teaching at Tier 1 using a validated curriculum and weaving this together? How would you feel about empowering your teachers with these specific strategies so that they know what to do, and that it's not like, I got to stop teaching to do the behavior thing. I'm going to weave the behavior thing into instruction. And I want to close with just a thought on Tier 2 and Tier 3 before you go into the rest of your learning today. And I just want to close with this story. Sometimes people think that Tier 2 is always a small group. It's always something that kids get pulled out to go to. And I want to invite you to shape your thinking today before you continue your learning about what Tier 2 can be. My daughter, whom I love and adore, and Tina mentioned, she's an Olympic weightlifter. She's a competitive CrossFit athlete. Do you guys know what CrossFit is? It's a whole lot of craziness. So when she was 15, I knew that the years were going to fly by because my son's the older one who went to college first. So I said to her, Katie, I would like to spend more time with you before you leave to go to college. And I'm like, how about we go to yoga together? And she's like, no offense, Mom, but yoga is for old ladies. I'm like, okay, shots fired, just a little bit. And I'm like, okay. So then I'm like, how about we go to Zumba? Let's do Zumba. She's like, okay, let's give it a whirl. So I was all up in this, doing this. I thought I was fairly stunning. She was like, that can never happen again. Off. I'm like, okay. She's like, Mom, if you want to spend time with me, you're welcome to come to the gym, because she's at CrossFit all the time. So I put on a pair of sweats, and I put on a sweatshirt, and I'm loaded, I'm locked and loaded, I'm walking in, and there's a thing that says warm up, skill building, strength conditioning, and WOD, which I thought was going to be gum, like you'd pass out gum at the end. That was the workout. So it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. This guy looks at me and he's like, come on over here. And so my daughter's on the rig doing chest to bars, so it's like more than a pull-up. And he's like, Kathleen, I'm going to give you a rubber band. So he gets this giant green rubber band, and I get in it, and there's still nothing happening. So he's like, you need 2 big rubber bands. I'm like, okay. So then I get on 2, and now I'm moving, and they're the thickest rubber bands you've ever seen. That was just the first activity. There was a whole lot of craziness getting out of the thing. There was a little bit of leakage. And following the first activity, that was jump rope. Let me just say, women at that time, 2 kids, 48, jump rope, just saying. And then the next activity is handstand push-ups. She's like, Kathleen, come on over here. So he puts this box down, which normally is used for like burpee box jumps overs, and then he puts a pad over here, and I'm like, what's the pad for? He's like, this is in case you lose control, I don't want you to hurt your head. I'm like, okay. So I'm laying on the box, and I'm doing these handstand pretend push-ups with this thing. And I'm telling you all this, I would consider everything that he did that day to be a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 support. I was in the room, I was not embarrassed, I was heavily adapted. And following that time, very shortly after, my daughter actually entered me into a CrossFit competition. And I won 3rd place for my age group. Thank you. Because there were 3 in my age group. And I'm just saying, I was rocking more cellulite on this body than anybody in that gym. In fact, all of them put together. But I'm telling you that when you walk out today, build a solid base. Empower your teachers. Keep an open mind as to how we can address Tier 2 and Tier 3. Let's give it up for Patton. Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you.